Hello and welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Zach with Fitness Simplified, and today what we're going to talk about is the interference effect, whether it exists, whether it is fake, and whether or not it is something that you need to worry yourself with. Just as a quick point of definition, the interference effect refers to the idea that strength training and aerobic training, i.e., cardio, conditioning, etc., have interfering effects on one another, and the presence of one in a program inhibits the progress made in another. Typically, it is said in a way that postulates the idea that the interference effect goes both ways, but more commonly when it's talked about, it is referred to in the sense that cardio is interfering with strength progression, or colloquially, something you might have heard people say is that cardio will kill your gains. Now, to save you a little bit of time, if you just want the quick answer, the overall take home from this video is going to be that the interference effect is about as real as Santa Claus. And if you or someone you know has been a victim to what you perceived to be an interference effect, then it is far more likely that it is some other variable apart from the pure presence of cardio or the pure presence of strength training that impaired your results. And what I mean by that, I call that pseudo interference. What I mean by that, we will discuss towards the end of this video. But with that said, the remainder of this video will talk about some of the arguments for and against the existence of the interference effect, what the actual outcome data says, and what I mean by mechanistic arguments and outcome-based arguments. I will quickly cover just so you have a better idea of what I mean when I or others say that. And then we'll cover what some sources of quote unquote pseudo interference might be. So first, let's talk about some of the mechanistic reasoning for the interference effect's existence, because the idea has existed for quite some time. And it was considered an accepted idea even by people for quite a good number of years. So you can infer that the idea of the interference effect didn't just poof out of midair. Certainly, there must be some degree of rational thinking behind it. So let's talk about what some of that might be. Actually, before I get into that, let's talk about what it means to base an argument off of mechanistic or outcome-based thinking, because that'll make everything that I say or what you hear other people say much more clear in regard to how you weigh people's arguments. So a mechanistic line of thinking basically says that X intervention leads to Y intermediate step, which leads to Z outcome. Generally, when people are talking from a mechanistic line of thinking, all that they say is that X intervention led to Y intermediate step, which they say just will lead to Z outcome. Outcome-based thinking, for all intents and purposes, ignores the Y intermediate step and says, let's implement X intervention and see what Z outcome is. Typically, things that are based off of outcome data or outcome-based line of thinking hold greater weight than mechanistic-based line of thinking. One, because they are more applicable and specific to what will happen in the real world. And two, there might be 10 different intermediate steps that the sum of which lead to Z outcome. And if you only focus on one, then you can't paint a clear picture of what the actual outcome in question will be. And that was worth bringing up now, because pretty much all of the arguments in favor of the idea that the interference effect does exist are mechanistic in nature, and therefore they are not strong arguments just by the nature of it. Now, there's many things people might say in this regard, in the regard of the interference effect existing, but the most plausible and commonly accepted is in regard to muscle fiber type shifting. So from a 30,000 foot view, there are two main types of muscle fibers. There are your type 1s that are considered your endurance, slow twitch, long lasting type muscle fibers. They can't produce a lot of force, but they can last for a very long time. And your type 2s that are considered your strength and power, your fast twitch, so to speak. They can produce a lot of force quickly, but they cannot sustain work for very long periods of time. So you can see how one might be more applicable to endurance-based events or to strength-based events. It does go deeper than that, but for the sake of this video, that's good enough to paint the idea. Now, with training, there is some degree of muscle fiber type shifting. So if you do a large amount of endurance type activity, there might be a shift from type 2 to type 1 muscle fibers. And if you purely do strength training based activities, then there might be a shift from type 1 to type 2 muscle fibers. From this, people have historically said that because that happens, that will lead to impaired strength or impaired endurance performance. Now, like I said, there are other arguments you might hear people make, such as interference at the molecular level between mTORC1 and AMPK. But the idea that that actually happens isn't quite clear cut. So for the sake of this video, we will not discuss that because that would require a higher level, or a deeper dive rather, I should say, into the research of the matter. But nonetheless, I want you to notice what I said, that X interventions such as endurance training or strength training led to Y intermediate step, muscle fiber type shift. Therefore, this will happen without the actual evidence of that Y disease step. And it is for that reason that the argument is not very strong, because it is based on an assumption that the Y to Z transition will happen. Now, just to level the playing field, before we talk about what the actual outcome data says, let's talk about some of the mechanistic reasoning in favor of the interference effect not existing. Now, there are many indirect benefits that strength training will have on endurance training and endurance training will have on strength training. There's two in particular that I'd like to highlight in this video, one going in each direction. So first, it is well understood that aerobic training or endurance training, you can also consider those two terms, endurance training or aerobic training, to be synonymous, to mean the same thing. It is well understood that that type of activity will increase muscle capillary density. So, in other words, the blood supply within your muscle, and increased capillary densities increase a person's capacity to build muscle in the first place. In the other direction, it is commonly accepted that strength training will improve things like running economy. And now running economy is the amount of energy it takes essentially for each step of running you take. So a person with higher running economy will spend less energy with each step of their foot than a person with lower running economy. And so a person with higher running economy, if you can only spend 500 calories on a run, they will go farther than the person with lower running economy. Now, again, in this regard, also, there's other things I can bring up, but the point of me saying that and bringing up these mechanistic-based arguments is to illustrate the idea that you can't necessarily just point to one mechanism and infer that some outcome will happen, because there's multiple mechanisms in each direction that are playing a role. And the only way to look at what the actual summation of all those mechanisms are to look at just what outcome data. And so in other words, when people actually combine strength training and aerobic training with all other factors isolated, what happens? Do they experience less strength and less endurance gains, or do they have no degree of an interference? So there are two systematic reviews and meta-analyses that look at this exact point. In other words, the actual outcome of what happens when people combine strength and endurance training. One of which was published in 2022 and looked specifically at what happens to strength performance in a strength isolated program or a strength plus endurance program. Their main findings was that there were no apparent degrees of interference on strength performance. There was a slight impairment on explosive power. And now the difference between power and strength is that strength refers to how much force you can produce total. Power refers to how quickly you can produce that force. And so the ability to produce power, high amounts of power, was slightly inhibited. Granted, the participants and the subjects in the study were not performing power training. So you can hypothesize that if they did, that would eliminate that degree of, inhibition of power. But nonetheless, the presence of cardio, endurance training, aerobic training, whatever you want to call it, did not limit strength gains or muscle gains. And to further illustrate this point, they did a number of subgroup analyses, and they found this to be the case whether running or cycling was used as the aerobic event, whether the subjects were older or younger than 40 years of age, no matter how many times per week they performed the aerobic training, and finally, whether they were highly trained or not highly trained. There was another systematic review meta-analysis that was also published in 2022. And by the way, just again, the article that contains all of the relevant citations next to the claims they're supporting will be linked below. So if you want to look into that, that's there for you. This paper looked at what happens to endurance performance. The subjects in this one were only older than 50 years of age, and they found no influence, or no interference rather, I should say, of the presence of strength training on aerobic performance. And although they didn't include younger subjects, generally younger individuals tend to adapt more easily to training than older ones. So you can infer, hypothetically at least, I should say, that the effect would be the same in younger participants. And as a final, less credible and probably less applicable form of evidence, I think it is to some degree helpful to look at the CrossFit Games athletes, because not only have they built their strength and their endurance to very high levels, They have built them to higher levels than most people who only do one will build them to in their entire lives, only doing the one form of training. Now, yes, they are professional athletes. Their life probably revolves around fitness. They probably have the best genes that money can buy, but nevertheless, they exist, which nods to the fact that the interference effect probably does not exist in the way that people think it does. Now, finally, to wrap up this video, I want to talk a little bit about what I, called before early in this video, the pseudo interference effect. And this is a term I'm using to describe an interference or an impairment in strength or endurance performance that is wrongly being attributed to the pure presence, the combination of strength and aerobic training, but is actually being caused by something else. The first and, in my opinion, most notable of factors that would fit this bill is just bad programming. Now, strength and endurance training do not inherently inhibit each other, independent of all other variables in the presence of a program. But if you have a bad program, you have a bad program. And if they're programmed together badly, then you might not see the results that you want to see. The biggest thing, more than anything, is just fatigue management and load management and things of that nature. Now, I have a number of other resources that cover this in more detail than I will in this video. I will link them below, and I will soon make videos on that. But the point I'm making here is largely to say, are you not seeing the progress you want to make because of the interference effect, or does your program just suck? Something else that I have seen happen before is that someone who weight trains regularly, let's say, starts adding cardio to the routine. And let's say this is a person who likes to train. They like to do a lot of exercise. So they start adding a lot of cardio and they inadvertently put themselves into a caloric deficit. And then they start not seeing as much strength gains as they saw before. Typically, if this happens, they will start saying it was the cardio that did it, when really their nutrition just wasn't in line with the amount of activity that they were doing. Now, again, I also have nutrition guides and resources that might be of interest to you. If you want to combine strength and aerobic training, I'll link some of those down below. And then the final one that I like to point out is sleep. Are you sleeping enough to recover from the training that you're doing? Because if you're sleeping 5 hours a night and you're not seeing the strength gains that you want to see, then the cardio that you might be doing is the last place you should look, and the bedtime is the first place that you should look. And with that said, that is about all that I wanted to cover in this video. I hope that added some clarity to the interference effect for you, and I hope that will help you be a bit more confident in your training and running training programs. Again, any resources I have in this regard, I will link down below if that would interest you. I want to thank you again for being here. It means a great deal to me, and I will see you next time.